Welcome to ANTRIM, the county town of Northern Ireland's largest county, County Antrim. Situated on the shores of Lough Neagh, the largest lake in the UK, Antrim is a picturesque and historic town that's full of things to see and do, just a few of which we'll see as we take a walk up through the heart of town today. We begin on the western edge of the town centre, in the grounds of Antrim Castle. Once upon a time a grand 17th century residence overlooking the town, all that remains of the castle today are its gardens, a grand motte, and a few stone ruins. Construction of the castle began in 1610, during the plantation of Ulster, and it served initially as the residence of an Englishman named Sir Hugh Clotworthy, who established a military headquarters here beside a burgeoning English settlement, which had sprung up on a ford across a small local river. Here, at what was once the corner of Antrim Castle, we find the remains of a small defensive stone wall that looks out onto the river which flows through Antrim, known as the 6 Mile Water. Crossed by the more than 300-year-old Deer Park Bridge that we can see just downstream, the 6 Mile Water, despite its name, actually flows for about 26 miles across southern County Antrim. Emptying into Lough Neagh just a short distance from here, it's not exactly clear how the 6 Mile Water got its name, the most popular story being that, just under 900 years ago, Anglo-Norman soldiers stationed at the coastal town of Carrickfergus walked 6 miles inland, and found a ford of this river on the outskirts of Ballyclare, thereby christening it the 6 Mile Water. We'll get another look at the 6 Mile Water later on in our walk, but here we're looking back in towards the exquisite grounds of the old Antrim Castle. We mentioned that the castle was originally constructed back in 1610, but the most prominent remains today are that of this striking tower, built much later in 1887. The tower was one of the last additions to the sprawling castle before it was eventually burned down in 1922, but just across the grass from it we find one of the oldest features in the castle complex, a large motte that was built over 800 years ago back in the late 12th century, when a small timber fortress would have stood atop it. The motte today is described as one of the finest remaining examples of Norman settlement in Northern Ireland, but when it came to the later plantation-era castle, the motte served more as a decorative feature than a defensive one, much like this beautiful tower. Designed in a fashionable Italian style in the late 19th century, this was built as a freestanding tower separate to the main castle buildings, with a staircase inside that allowed people to walk up to the top and take in views across the gardens and the 6 Mile Water. The fact that the tower stood on its own may have been part of the reason why it remains standing today, although displayed on this plinth you'll also find copies of the original stone-carved coats of arms that once stood above the castle's main entrance, depicting the heraldic symbols of King Charles II, Sir Hugh Clotworthy, and his wife, Lady Marion Langford. But while these stones, the Victorian-era tower and the Norman-era motte, are examples of how those from England established a strong presence in Antrim, the town was also a significant site in Gaelic Ireland. Antrim's history can be traced back around 1500 years to 495 AD, when a small monastery was founded under the name ANTRIM, an Irish name thought to refer to a single house or place of habitation. Around the same period, on the outskirts of Antrim, there developed a large ring fort known as Rochmore, which served as the capital of the Gaelic kingdom of Dol Northa, which roughly corresponds to the territory of modern-day County Antrim. The seat of the Dol Northa kings and the small early medieval monastery remained in existence for centuries, but soon declined in the 11th and 12th centuries, roughly the time when Anglo-Norman settlers were beginning to stake their claim in this area. Under the Normans, Antrim became known as Antrim, and the town came to serve as a modest stronghold for John de Courcy, an English knight who was appointed the Earl of Ulster by King John in the early 13th century. De Courcy wielded great power over the Anglo-Norman settlements in County Antrim, most notably in the coastal stronghold of Carrickfergus, but also here in Antrim, where he built the motte that still stands today. The Normans' power in Ulster later declined, however, and they were superseded by a return to Gaelic supremacy, primarily under the local O'Neill clan, who held the land for a couple of hundred years before the plantation of Ulster at the turn of the 17th century. And that brings us to the castle that we're strolling through now, originally constructed in the 1610s by Sir Hugh Clotworthy, but expanded significantly in the 1660s by his son, John Clotworthy. Under John Clotworthy, Antrim Castle was more of a fortified manor house than the kind of medieval fortress you may be thinking of, complete with exquisite gardens that were unique at the time in Ulster, and which were later expanded in the 19th century with the development of these, the terrace gardens. By this point in history, Antrim Castle had lost its need to serve as a defensive structure, so sprawling new gardens were developed to serve multiple new purposes, both as a calming place to walk through, but also as a place to grow herbs that would be used in the castle kitchen. What remains of the terrace gardens are beautifully preserved, but the grounds of Antrim Castle are today intersected by the slightly less picturesque A6 road. As we mentioned briefly, Antrim Castle, still a grand residence just over 100 years ago, met its end in 1922 when it was burned down in a fire. For a long time afterwards, the charred ruins of Antrim Castle were simply left here, until the majority was demolished in 1970, leaving just the few remains that we've seen so far. Just across the road, however, there are more stone remains of the castle to be seen, these being more recent features of the castle that were built during an extensive remodelling of the residence in the 1810s. By this point, Antrim Castle had been in existence for around 200 years, and had even seen its fair share of incidents through that time, notably being raided by Jacobites in the late 17th century, and experiencing the significant Battle of Antrim in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which we'll talk more about later. As such, a reworking of the castle was very much in order, and it was on this eastern side where the bulk of that work took place, facing towards the civilian town of Antrim. And here we find the crowning achievement of that remodelling process, the Grand Barbican Gate, built in 1818 and which formed the main entrance to the castle from the town centre. That's a role which the Barbican Gate, designed with grand Tudor features, still plays to this day, and if you visit Antrim Castle, you can walk through the Barbican Gate and make your way through an underground walkway beneath the A6. Just in front of the slightly more modern castle walls here, meanwhile, we also find a local monument in the form of Antrim's new war memorial, dedicated to the locals who lost their lives fighting in the First World War. Having made our way through the grounds of Antrim Castle and explored its history in detail, it's now time that we left the historic fortress behind, and made our way into the heart of modern Antrim, a delightful town of around 20,000 people today. Just outside the Barbican Gate, you'll find the town's sprawling and recently redeveloped market square, on which there stands the grand old courthouse. Built all the way back in 1726, Antrim's old courthouse is today the oldest courthouse still standing in Northern Ireland. Originally occupying just the upper floor, while the arcaded ground floor was used for hosting local markets, in the early 19th century, the market venue downstairs was converted into a prison yard for those awaiting trial upstairs. The building was used as the main venue for local justice for nigh on 300 years, eventually shutting up shop in 1994, although in 2010, the building was reopened as a popular town centre theatre. The old courthouse remains one of the oldest and grandest landmarks that you'll find in the modern town, most of which are lined alongside the busy High Street here, which runs parallel to the 6 Mile Water, and which is also home to most of Antrim's main shops, churches, hotels, pubs and more. We'll get a look at all of the highlights of the High Street as we make our way eastwards through town. But before we do, let's take a quick look at a map of Northern Ireland, to get a better idea of exactly where this town is located. As we mentioned, Antrim is located in the very south of County Antrim, on the shore of Lough Neagh, roughly 20 miles to the northwest of Belfast, and conveniently located just 4 miles away from Belfast International Airport, Northern Ireland's largest and busiest airport. Antrim is the closest major town to the airport, but while this isn't often the main destination for most landing there, Antrim has benefited greatly from its geographical position over time, bringing it to the town that we know today. There's a lot of character to the town of Antrim today, but just across the road from us in dark green, we can see one of the longest running and most beloved local institutions, Madden's Bar, also known as the Silver Dollar. Run by members of the Madden family since the 1960s, the pub remains one of the many great places to get a drink or a bite to eat on Antrim's High Street, a business that's been central to the street for decades. Back in the Industrial Revolution, Ulster, and particularly the region around Belfast, grew to become the most densely populated in all of Ireland, and Antrim served as an urban centre for towns and villages in the surrounding region, which people would visit to buy goods, do business, or indeed find a place to stop off while travelling through. Hostelry, in the form of taverns and inns, brought in a decent amount of money to Antrim for decades, especially when this town lay on the main route between the cities of Belfast and Derry. But Antrim also boasted its own industry too, prospering with busy linen, cotton and paper mills that sprung up alongside the 6 Mile Water. The river's flow provided important power to local mills, which developed as a satellite to the rapidly growing industrial city of Belfast, or Linenopolis as it came to be known. Once again then, we find ourselves overlooking the 6 Mile Water, standing here on the Masserine Bridge, the oldest bridge in the heart of town, built 314 years ago in 1708. The Masserine Bridge takes its name from the Viscount Masserine, a nobleman in the peerage of Ireland, who in turn takes his name from Masserine, the name by which this area became known during the era of the O'Neill clan, before the plantation of Ulster. Masserine is a name that you'll still see in a number of places around Antrim, from an old military barracks on the edge of town to a prestigious local golf club. But as we look upstream along the 6 Mile Water, the site of Masserine Bridge here is also thought to be located not too far from the river ford around which the late 16th century English settlement of Antrim emerged. We already know that the status of the English town of Antrim was cemented by the building of the castle in the 1610s, but a few decades earlier, during the Elizabethan age, the origins of the town were set when a military road was built through this area, crossing the 6 Mile Water at Antrim. The military road was the work of English troops, sent into Ulster to suppress the powerful O'Neill clan, driving them out of County Antrim and towards County Tyrone on the other side of Lough Neagh. These troops would take boats back and forth across the loch, and it was interestingly on the shore of the modern Masserine Golf Club where these boats are said to have docked. Therefore, with a road running through this area, the banks of the 6 Mile Water soon became the place of a more permanent town, primarily composed of English settlers, but not entirely so. Straddling the high street in front of us here, we can see Antrim's Orange Arch, erected as part of celebrations for the 12th, the annual holiday in Northern Ireland which commemorates the Battle of the Boyne, and William of Orange's victory over the Jacobites back in 1690. The Orange Arch here is symbolic of the Unionist population in Antrim, a majority in the town. According to the latest census in 2021, just over half of the people in the wider area of Antrim and Newton Abbey were brought up in a Protestant background, while over 90% of people have a British and/or Northern Irish national identity, a significant proportion whose origins can be traced back to that 16th century English settlement. But as we mentioned, it wasn't just English people who came to settle in what became modern Antrim, as the town soon attracted an influx of Scottish settlers too, who helped to develop the local industry in the early years of the 17th century. Shortly, we'll be making our way into Antrim's Scotch Quarter, where mostly Scottish people settled. But just here we're looking towards two town centre churches, the former High Street Presbyterian Church of 1837 on the right, and the soaring All Saints Parish Church on the left. The old Presbyterian church here was vacated when the congregation built a bigger church just a bit further out of town, but All Saints here remains very much in use to this day, as it has done for over 400 years. Originally built for the Old English settlement all the way back in 1596, All Saints here is one of the oldest parish churches still in use in all of Ireland, and it's a rare example of Elizabethan-era architecture, although the tower and spire that we can see today are much newer, added in 1816. Peering through the gates of the churchyard, we can see the stones of the older Elizabethan-era nave just in front, neighboured by one of many monuments in and outside of the church. All Saints here housing memorials and the resting places of members of the Masserine family, along with the locally born author Alexander Irvine, who we'll talk about in more detail in a couple of minutes. With the addition of the Victorian-era tower and spire, All Saints Church looks splendid in the modern day. But like the castle, this church has seen quite a lot of action over its more than 4 centuries of existence. Just in the shadow of the parish church, we find ourselves on the small, winding road known as Riverside, so named as it follows the path of the 6 Mile Water as it flows into the town centre from the south. Where Riverside is today is closer to the original site of the ford than the Masserine Bridge, and as such, this was where English troops passed through Antrim before the town really grew into what we know today. We mentioned that English troops originally came here to drive out the O'Neill clan from County Antrim, but after the establishment of the plantation-era settlement here, and the building of the castle, things didn't immediately settle down. Just a couple of decades later, in the 1640s, a resurgent O'Neill force laid siege to the town of Antrim during the Irish Rebellion, although they failed to capture it. But when the Wars of the Three Kingdoms broke out shortly afterwards, in the conflict between King Charles I and the English Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, Antrim sided with Parliament, a decision which ruffled a few feathers. During that time, Sir John Clockworthy, resident of the castle, was jailed for his support of the king. But in 1649, the royalist general George Munro burned the town of Antrim to the ground in revenge for the town's support of Parliament, and only a few houses escaped the fire unscathed. More conflict was to come, however, as Antrim became a flashpoint again in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. The rebellion was led by the United Society of Irishmen, which had evolved into a large revolutionary group fighting against British rule, and demanding political representation for men of all religions in Ireland, Catholic and Protestant. At the time, Antrim, as the county town, was a place of great regional and political significance, but it was only defended by a small garrison of British soldiers, and so Irish rebels set their sights on capturing the town. The Battle of Antrim then unfolded on the 7th of June 1798, and much of the fighting took place here, in the town's Scotch quarter. A body of around 200 Irish rebels marched into the heart of town along Church Street beside us, heading for a clash with British government troops as they aimed for Antrim Castle. Throughout the day, the parish churchyard served as the rebels' main stronghold, occupying higher ground above the fighting unfolding here and on the High Street, although after a period of fierce fighting, the rebels were pushed out of the town by the British troops. And unfortunately, as was customary after so many battles at the time, the victorious British government troops then decided to set about ransacking the area where the rebels had fought, more specifically the Scotch Quarter, looting and burning houses, and even murdering locals they suspected of having supported the rebels' cause. The Scotch Quarter has fortunately rebounded in the 2 and a bit centuries since, and it's played a role as the effective home of Presbyterianism in Ireland, the religion born in Scotland and which spread widely across the Emerald Isle after the Ulster Plantation. In a couple of minutes we'll get a look at one of Ireland's oldest Presbyterian meeting houses, but the Scotch Quarter here is also notable as the birthplace of a famous local author, Dr. Alexander Irvine, who was born in 1863. Irvine, depicted in this eye-catching mural, is one of County Antrim's most celebrated sons, best known for his classic memoir, My Lady of the Chimney Corner, which he wrote in 1913 in tribute to his mother. The book recounts Irvine's upbringing and the impact that his mother's advice and values had on his life, and much of the story unfolds right here in Antrim at Alexander Irvine's childhood home, today known as Pogue's Entry. Situated just off the main road through town, Irvine grew up in this small 18th century cottage, where he was the 9th of 12 children. A cramped house it therefore would have been, but his upbringing, and the story of My Lady of the Chimney Corner, struck a chord with many readers around Ireland for its down-to-earth and deeply genuine depiction of normal life for people in the years shortly after the Great Famine. Ireland's population had infamously been decimated by the famine in the 1840s and 50s, which caused the deaths of around 1 million people, and left a lasting impact for years afterwards, with families like Irvine's living in poverty in small, cramped houses, continuing to struggle. Still, throughout his early life, Irvine kept busy here, working as a paperboy, a miner and a soldier, before he eventually moved across the pond to the United States at the age of 25, where he went on to study at Yale University. But as we make our way out of Pogue's Entry now, Irvine's childhood home today serves as a visitor attraction in Antrim town, with the house preserved as it was in those days and featuring a museum, bookshop and separate craft studio to boot, all situated in an atmospheric little close just off the main road here. Having returned to the main road, however, we remain in the heart of Antrim's Scotch Quarter, which we mentioned a few moments ago served as the effective home of Presbyterianism in Ireland. In white, just across the road from us, there stands the original Presbyterian meeting house for the people of Antrim, built all the way back in 1700. Before this, Presbyterians would worship at All Saints, which belonged to the Anglican Church of Ireland, but the building of a separate meeting house helped to grow the community of Presbyterians in Antrim over the years. Directly across the road from the Presbyterian meeting house, meanwhile, there stands the rather exquisite Antrim Masonic Hall, built in the late 19th century and daubed with a colourful and intricately designed facade looking out onto Church Street. The Masonic Hall exists as one of a number of meeting places still in operation in Antrim town, but the original Presbyterian meeting house, having started out as the place where all local Presbyterians congregated, soon saw its congregation split into two around the start of the 19th century. This came about as a result of a wider split among Irish Presbyterians on matters of individual conscience in faith, and it gave birth to a separate church known as the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church of Ireland. The non-subscribing Presbyterians, the smaller and newer of the two groups, retained Antrim's original meeting house as their own, while the larger congregation belonging to the Presbyterian Church in Ireland decided to move out and establish their own meeting house, although not too far away from where they'd started out. In fact, their new home was directly across the road, here at what was christened the First Antrim Presbyterian Church, the church halls facing out onto the main road here, while the main church is located a little further back. What appears as a fairly unassuming building in Antrim's Scotch Quarter, then, was the result of a lot of history coming together over the years, the Scottish settlement of the area and the Presbyterian split just one part of that. But as we've explored on our walk around Antrim, this medium-sized and by no means showy town has a whole lot more to it than first meets the eye, with a wide array of captivating highlights and enthralling history. Sadly, however, that brings us to the end of our walk around Antrim for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting historic Antrim for yourself sometime soon.